Now with the alert controller added, we're pretty much done. One of the missing things is that I also want to redirect here in this very unlikely case that we somehow get to this page without having a recipe in the URL. So I will do that there. And with that, I'm happy with that setup, with what we achieved here. I hope you see why using Angular together with Ionic can be helpful. And in the end, it's just a normal Angular app with the Ionic magic added to it, you could say. This therefore is of course the setup I'll continue with for the rest of the course and with which we'll build the entire course project then. There's one more thing I want to show you just to make this really clear on how it works and how it works together with Ionic. Obviously, in this Angular project, you can still create your normal Angular components which you use with their selectors in your templates. So you cannot just generate pages with Angular components. You can still use them as you use them in any Angular project. So I can use Ionic generate here again. And as you will see, besides being able to create a page, I can also create a normal component. So let's go with that. Of course, you could have typed Ionic generate component as well. And the path will be recipes, recipe item here. And this will simply be a single recipe item which I output here in my list. So I will grab this item code here from the recipes page component and add it to the HTML file of my recipe item component. So this is now not a full Ionic page. It is just keeping or containing some Ionic components, and it could also just contain other Angular components or normal HTML. The key takeaway is this will not be rendered as an Ionic page. I also don't want to have ng4 on this item here. Instead, in recipe item, I want to have a property, recipe item maybe, which will be a recipe, so it will be of type recipe, and therefore you should import recipe from the recipe model file. And this will be bindable from outside. How does that work in Angular? Well, you add input in front of it, right? And input is imported from @Angular core. So you can continue building these normal Angular components with inputs, outputs, and so on. Here we're using an input and make recipe item bindable from outside. Therefore, in the template of recipe item, I can use recipe item here and here because that is the name of my property now, of that bindable property. And we can now start using recipe item by its selector in our recipes page. Now, recipes module was automatically updated by the Ionic CLI, and it added recipe item component there to the declarations, which is correct because I want to use it in this module. I want to use it in the recipes page. So declaring it in the app module or anything like that would have been wrong. You have to declare it in the module where you use it, and we do use it here. So now in the recipes page component file here, we can use app recipe item. That is the selector of the component that was created. You can, of course, see that here in the component TypeScript file. And all we have to do is we have to pass in a value for our recipe item. Now, this can be done by still going through all our recipes with ng4 here. So recipe of recipes, this doesn't change. And that recipe is then forwarded as a recipe item to the app recipe item component. And with that, if you save that, it should now rebuild and work in exactly the same way as before. Here we have our items and we can still tap them and navigate around. So this works as before, and I'm simply showing you this because I really want to make sure that you understand that this is a normal Angular project and you can build Angular components as you're used to. And indeed, if you compare Angular components and Ionic components, you'll see that you use them in a similar way inside of your Angular project. Of course, Angular components are created by you with that component, or you're importing some other third-party library. And actually, as I mentioned, @Ionic/Angular, this package, in the end wraps all the Ionic web components into Angular components. So technically, these also are Angular components now, but they're only thinly wrapped. In its core, they're still web components. So we create our own components with that component. We use them inside of our Angular templates, and that's the only place where we can use them. Angular will render them to the DOM for us, will render the content of their templates to the DOM for us. And as I mentioned, we can only use Angular components in an Angular app. Ionic components. Well, Ionic ships these pre-built web components and you can't edit them. They're open source, but you can't edit them. They will not allow you to merge your changes into the Ionic repository without a very good reason. Ionic components use native web technologies. They are web components, and yes, they are wrapped here by @Ionic Angular, but in its core, there's still web components in there. And you can therefore use these web components anywhere, in any project, anywhere, not just inside of Angular apps. And I mentioned this a couple of times. I think it's pretty clear now. It is just important to understand, which is why I'm emphasizing this over and over again.